Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Tourism and Hospitality Service Management, SOTHSM. Bachelor of Arts, Tourism Studies, BTS, English. Elective Courses, EHI 01 Modern India 1857 to 1964. Block-1 Imperialism, Colonialism and Nationalism. Unit 2 Imperialism, Its Effects. 2.0 Objectives. In this unit we intend to study the impact of colonialism on Indian society in details and spell out the economic, social and political effects of the British colonial rule in India. This unit shows that the colonial state was a serviceable instrument not so much for the modernization of Indian economy and society as for maintaining the logic of colonial state. After reading this unit, you will be able to learn the various theories of colonialism, both European as well as those formulated by Indian nationalists, the impact of colonialism on Indian economy in terms of the industrialization and commercialization of agriculture, how modern industry emerged in India and the role of capitalist class, and some of the political aspects of the colonial process. 2.1 Introduction. In order to understand the nature of colonialism and its economic, social and political impact on India, it is necessary to comprehend colonialism in a world perspective. If we look at India alone, we shall fail to understand the structural logic of imperialism, and a good deal of what happened might appear to be due to the bad policies, or from another point of view, good policies, of certain individual figures among the British rulers and policy framers in India. A great deal of historical criticism in the past has been done in these terms: how a misguided governor-general or a bad administrator or a negligent public opinion in England allowed or brought about bad things to happen to Indian people. The apologists for the empire have invariably repeated the same discourse on good-bad policies. Even the nationalist leaders of the early days were not entirely free from this type of superficial thinking about the empire. They were able to build a convincing case against the exploitative and oppressive aspects of British rule, but lacked the broader perspective which enabled the later-day critics, including those influenced by Marxism, to locate colonialism within the context of capitalist imperialism or the capitalist world system, and thus enhanced our understanding of the historical developments within its component part, the Indian Empire. The later approach to the phenomenon of colonial expansion can be traced back to some early 20th century critics of imperialism: Hobson, Hilferding, Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin. In India, this approach was developed by, among others, M. N. Roy, Jawaharlal Nehru and R. P. Dutt etc. 2.2 Theories of colonialism. Let us examine the various theories propounded by Europeans as well as Indian nationalists in relation to colonialism. 2.2.1 European views. Hobson, far from being a Marxist, was a conventional British Labour Party intellectual who propounded a theory of colonial empire building. His major work Imperialism was published in 1902. He thought that capitalism was bound to engender such expansionism or imperialism. Capitalist system, he pointed out, means a very uneven distribution of income. Large profits accumulate in the hands of the capitalist and the wages of the worker are low. Thus the low level of income of the large mass of workers under capitalism keeps the level of consumption low. What is the result? On account of underconsumption, all the industrial products that are produced cannot be sold within the country, for there are no buyers. What can the capitalist do under these circumstances? He can try to sell the excess produce that cannot be marketed within the country to foreign markets. If all capitalist countries follow this policy, there will be a struggle to capture markets and to secure captive markets in the form of colonies. Thus colonial expansion and conflict between capitalists of different countries, according to Hobson, were inevitable outcomes of the capitalist system. Further, due to the above constraint of underconsumption, the opportunities for investment for the capitalist become limited in the long run. At the same time, profit keeps on accumulating and there are savings waiting to be invested. This is what Hobson called oversaving, which again tended to push the capitalists towards colonial expansion. Acquisition of colonies would make investment of surplus capital possible. To sum it up, Hobson's theories of underconsumption and oversaving suggested that colonial expansion or imperialism was a logical corollary of the capitalist system. 8 years after the publication of Hobson's work, Rudolf Hilferding published, 1910, another important analysis, focusing attention on finance capitalism. A social democrat, a brilliant economist, and for a while the finance minister of Germany, Hilferding had to seek refuge in Paris after the rise of Hitler and Nazism in Germany. When Paris was occupied by the German invading army, Hilferding was captured and killed by them. This heroic leader of the Central European socialist movement is known for his penetrating analysis of the ultimate phase of capitalism. During this phase, capitalism, as Hilferding pointed out, is dominated by huge banks and financial interests who act in close association with monopolist industrial business houses. This analysis of finance capitalism was further extended by V.I. Lenin in his tract on Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism, 1916. In 1913, Rosa Luxemburg also published her work on accumulation of capital and the stages of imperialist expansionism. She was a socialist leader who migrated from Poland to Germany. Intellectually and politically, she left a mark on the European socialist movement and continued to play an important part until she fell a victim to the Nazi onslaught. As for Lenin, all that perhaps needs to be said here is that this tract on imperialism was written to expose the capitalist machinations leading to World War. His ultimate aim was to dissuade the Russian people from engaging in a war that was caused by conflict of interests between the financial monopolists of Western Europe. It was a very successful piece of polemical writing which deeply influenced Marxist historiography. 2.2.2 Indian nationalist views. Independent of this critique of imperialism developed by Hobson, Hilferding and Lenin, the nationalists and India in their scholarly and polemical writings offered a sharp and telling criticism of the colonial economic impact on India. Through the works of Dadabhai Nauroji, Mahadev Gobind Ranade, Romesh Chandra Dutt and many others, who developed a school of economic nationalist analysis which highlighted some important features of India's experience under British rule. The main components of this analysis were as follows. I. The concept of drain of wealth evolved in the writings of Nauroji and Dutt. 2. Them it meant the transfer of wealth from the late 18th century in the form of plunder and loot and illicit gains by servants of the East India Company and in the form of home charges, i.e. the expenses incurred by the government of India in England out of its income derived mainly from the taxation of the Indian people, and finally, in the form of interests and profits and capital transfer from India to England on private account. Nationalist critics pointed out how drain in these different forms impoverished this country and increased the economic gap between India and England, which was the destination of the drain of wealth. They also pointed out how British regime brought about the destruction of the small-scale industries of India, a process that in more recent times has been called the industrialization. The idea of free trade and laissez-faire, nationalists contended, led to a tariff and industrial policy which stifled the possibilities of growth of industries in British India. Consequently, India became the agricultural farm of industrial England, i.e. a source of raw materials and food grains, dependent totally on industrial supplies from England. The rate of taxation of agriculture was also criticized by R.C. Dutt, who felt that the burden of land revenue was excessive in areas which were subjected to periodical temporary settlements. This, in his opinion, was the cause of frequent recurrence of famines in British India. Wealth of the countryside was drained away through the revenue collection machinery, making the economic viability of farming so precarious that the farmer could not withstand failure of rain and other natural disasters. Finally, an important part of the nationalist analysis of British economic policy in India was their criticism of government expenditure on the army, the police and other apparatus of government. The expenditure was so excessive that developmental investments were neglected. For example, the low expenditure on irrigation works contrasted sharply with the generous expenditure on the British Indian Army, the railways, etc. We shall discuss the above issue later in detail. For the present, it may, however, be noted that most of the criticisms voiced by these two schools, the European socialists, as well as the Indian nationalists, relate to the phases of colonialism that correspond to the stage of industrial capitalism and finance capitalism in Europe. See the stages of colonialism in Unit 1. Further, one may note that the Indian nationalists' critique is naturally directed towards features characterizing formal imperialism, i.e. imperialism as witnessed in India under formal political subjugation of the colony under British imperial power. The European socialists like Hobson, Hilferding, etc., addressed themselves, on the other hand, to a study of imperialist in a more general way, also taking into account informal imperialism, where political subjugation of the colony might not have occurred, but economic colonialism characterized metropolitan colonial relations, e.g., in the case of China or the Latin American countries. Finally, we may also note that unlike the Indian nationalist approach developed by Nauroji Ranade, R.C. Dutt etc., the Hobsonian or Leninist approach linked colonialism to the world system of capitalism. Colonial exploitation, to Hobson and others, was a natural, systemic product of capitalism as it evolved in Europe, not merely an aberration caused by wrong policies in Europe. On the whole, the critique of imperialism offered by the Indian nationalists was one of the most powerful instruments of building national consciousness among a subject people. The latter-day nationalist spokesmen, like Jawaharlal Nehru, developed and strengthened this critique by incorporating into it some elements derived from the Marxian, Hobsonian and Leninist approach to imperialism. 2.3 Effects of colonialism. You have read about the various stages of colonialism in Unit 1. But how did these stages affect the Indian economy? The artisan, peasant, worker and merchant, practically all sections of the Indian society were affected by colonial policies. In this section we shall deal with the economic impact of colonialism. 2.3.1 The Industrialisation. The destruction of traditional Indian industries was one of the earliest consequences of colonialism to be noticed and documented in this country. While it was evidently connected with the growth of modern factory industry in England, the beginning of the process of destruction of Indian cottage industries lay further back, in the 18th century, when the products of Indian industries were still prized as valuable items of commerce. In that early stage of mercantile capitalism, the source of profit of the East Indian Company was the difference between the cost prices in India and the sale prices in England of the Indian industrial products like cotton and silk textiles. This price difference, i.e. the profit rates of the English East India Company, could be increased if the Indian cost price at which East Indian Company purchased goods from the Indian artisans could be lowered, so long as there was a competitive market in India, that is, so long as the English East Indian Company was competing in the Indian market with other East India Companies of the French or the Dutch and with other merchants of Indian and Asian origin, the Indian artisans were in a good bargaining position. But in the last decades of the 18th century, the British gradually eliminated most of their competitors, in particular the French and the Dutch. Moreover, by virtue of their military power and, in some regions, e.g. Bengal from 1765, their political and administrative position, the British established a hegemony which allowed them to become monopolists in the market. The English companies purchased, together with the purchases of the servants of that company in their private capacity, accounted for a very large portion of the marketed textiles of superior quality in Bengal. As we all know, a monopolist can influence the market to his own advantage. In the last 3 decades of the 18th century, this was the advantage which enabled the English traders to reduce the prices paid to the native artisans in this country and thus to reap high profits from sale in the European market. This excessive exploitation of Indian artisans weakened the very basis of our handicraft industries by reducing the artisan to a low level of income. It also destroyed the possibility of accumulation of resources to invest in the industry and to improve its high technology. As we know, accumulation of capital and a technological revolution occurred in England in the last decades of the 18th and early decades of the 19th century. This industrial revolution first of all wiped out the market for India's artisans in Europe, because the economies of large-scale production in the new English factories made it impossible for artisanal products to compete with factory products. By the beginning of the 19th century, the staple industrial exports, cotton, textiles, began to decline and soon they ceased to be exported. Some other items, e.g. indigo and raw silk, continued to be exported, though from 1813 it was no longer the East India Company but private trade which became the agency for exports. Not only was the export market of the Indian artisans taken away by the foreign factories, but the home market began to be invaded by imported factory products. This is the process which has been called de-industrialization, since it is the reverse of the process of industrialization. Here we may pay attention to the debate that has taken place on the question of deindustrialization in India in course of the 19th century. Romesh C. Dutt and Madan Mohan Malviya, in his note of dissent to the Indian Industrial Commission, used the statistics of import to prove their point. They showed, for example, Thai import of Manchester cloth increased in value from 96 lakh sterling in 1860 to 27 crore sterling in 1900. Some recent authors, particularly Morris David Moms, argue that this evidence is not decisive. They argue that under Pax Britannica the population increased, the per capita income increased, the sale of cloth increased due to change in consumption habits, and thus it was possible for Indians to buy more foreign cloth, leaving the market for indigenous artisans unaffected. In short, Morris's argument is that the market expanded so that it was possible to accommodate both Manchester and Indian weavers. Produce. Manchester cloth, Morris maintained, did not displace indigenous weavers' cloth. This view of Morris is unacceptable because he does not produce any evidence to prove increase in population and per capita income during the 19th century. There is plenty of evidence put forward by recent economic historians like Sardar Raju for Madras, N.K. Sinha for Bengal, A.V. Raman Rao for Andhra, R.D. Choksi for Maharashtra and A.K. Bagchi for Bihar, etc., which lends support to the deindustrialization thesis. The early nationalist economists did not have access to the sources and methods used by these recent economic historians, but their conclusion regarding the industrialization is confirmed by the findings of later researches. In the Middle Gangetic region, according to Bagchi's estimate, the industrial decline can be measured with some accuracy. The weight of industry in the livelihood pattern of the people was reduced by half from 1809 to 13 to the census year 1901. That the process of the industrialization continued up to the last decade of the 19th century is established beyond question. Did the growth of new industrial activities in the last decade of the 19th century restore the balance? D. Neil Thorner has put forward the controversial thesis that the census statistics available from 1881 do not suggest that the industrialization was in progress from 1881 to 1931. At first sight, the census figures indicate that the male workforce in agriculture increased from 65% in 1881 rose 72% in 1931, while the proportion in industry declined from 16% in 1881 to 9% in 1931. But Thorner believes that this categorization was erroneous and one should lump together agricultural workforce with another category, general labors, and likewise aggregate industrial workforce with trade. If that is done, the picture looks different. The increase in the compounded categories appears to be far less in the primary sector, only are about 2% growth between 1881 and 1931. Similarly, the decline in industry and trade I put together is also much less, only about 3% decline in 1881 to 1931. Further, Thorner dismisses the data on female labor force on the ground that the data collected were inaccurate in the opinion of census officials. In this way, Thorner arrives at the conclusion that the 1881 to 1931 census does not show any evidence of substantial industrialization. In criticism of Thorner, one obvious point is that the process of industrialization had already done the damage well before the census operations began. The first reliable all-India census was that of 1881. This much Thorner is himself willing to concede. Secondly, he is perhaps wrong in dismissing the figures regarding employment of women. These figures for 1881 to 1931 show an increase in employment in agriculture by 13% and a decline in industrial employment by 9%. In the Indian social context, the employment of women is quite significant, and it is likely that in case of decline in artisans' business, the women of the household gave up industrial work to take up household chores or agricultural labor earlier than menfolk in the artisan families. Above all, there is the question, how reliable is the sectoral distribution of workforce as an index of industrialization or its reverse? The crucial index is the per capita productivity, and the value of what is produced as a proportion of national produce, i.e. ratio to national income. J. Krishnamurthy has, on this ground, cast doubts upon the use of demographic data, as in Thorner's argument, to answer the question, was there the industrialization? Lastly, we may note that there was also an important trend of imperialist apologists, which frankly admitted the industrialization of India as a fact but argued that it was good for both India and Britain that the colony specialized in the production of agricultural goods. As late as 1911, Lord John Maynard Keynes wrote that industrializing India was neither possible nor desirable. India could, in fact, attain greater prosperity by exchanging agricultural products for all the industrial goods that may be needed through imports from the West. This view goes back to the classical Theory of comparative advantage and international division of labor, assigning to colonies like India the RDE of the agricultural farm of the industrialized imperial country. One of the real achievements of the nationalist economists was to defeat this view and to establish in the political agenda of the freedom struggle the economic program of India's industrialization. 2.3.2 Famines in colonial India. If colonialism meant destruction of old industries, did it mean the growth of agricultural production? The answer is probably negative on the whole. It is decidedly negative. When we consider per capita and per acre productivity in food grains from 1898 to 1947. As for the earlier 50 years, the repeated occurrence of current famines tell its own story. From the middle of the 19th century, a number of famines devastated India. In the following figures we mention the famines which the government acknowledged during this period. Famines in colonial India. Look at the screen. These figures include native states and in some instances, e.g. Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. The present-day states are mentioned on account of various changes in nomenclature in those IGNs. According to official estimates, in these famines the total loss of life was at least 1 crore and 52 lakhs, and the total number of famine-affected people was 39.7 crores. These vast numbers indicate periods of subsistence crisis. The immediate cause for this undoubtedly was droughts and crop failure, but the roots of the crises lay in what was the normal rate of agrarian production. Stagnation in agricultural technology, failure of investment to raise yield per acre, the drain of the agriculturists' resources into the hands of the revenue intermediaries and money lenders and dealers in agricultural commodities were undoubtedly important contributing factors. The sparseness of government investments in irrigation and other developmental investments, and the rapid rise in population from 1920s were also responsible for creating the colonial agricultural normalcy. A significant index of the normal situation in respect of food supply is the per capita availability of food grains in India. We have three estimates in this regard for the period 1901 to 1943. In these years, according to George Blunt's estimate for British India, per capita food grain availability declines from 0.23 ton to 0.16 ton. According to Shivasubramanian's estimate for the whole undivided India, the decline was from 0.2 ton to 0.14 ton. According to Alan Heston, the decline was from 0.17 ton, 1901, to 0.16 ton, 1946. Thus all the estimates indicate that the supply of food grains declined in the last half-century of British rule, though they differ on the extent to which it occurred. 2.3.3 Commercialization of agriculture. As we have already seen, the food grain production did not improve, but this was not true of some so-called cash crops. Both the total and per acre output of non-food grain crops increased, and this was largely due to increased demand and rising prices of these, both in the external and the internal market. The most dramatic increase of this sort was the cotton boom of the early 1860s, which merits our special attention. The emancipation of the black slaves by Abraham Lincoln and the consequent civil war in USA led to a massive shortfall in the world supply of cotton in 1860-64. This led to the increase in cotton prices, export of cotton from India, and the growth on cotton cultivating acreage in India. This cotton boom brought the Indian peasants in cotton growing areas within the ambit of the world capitalist system. The important export houses of Bombay, the wholesale traders in the big cities, the brokers and other middlemen in cotton export trade, down to the level of the village baniya who advance credit to the peasant for cotton cultivation, all profited enormously from the cotton boom. This profit, as well as the profit from the commercial crops developed even earlier, viz., opium and indigo, contributed to the accumulation of capital in the hands of some Indian businessmen. More important was the fact that the cotton boom marked the recruitment of India as a supplier of agricultural commodities and raw material needed by the industrialized West. Thus it complemented the process of the industrialization. The role of the colony specializing in agriculture and of the industrialized metropolitan country in the West were demarcated clearly in the contemporary theory of international division of labor. This was characteristic not only of India and England, but also of other colonies and metropolises in the stage of industrial capitalist imperialism. The statistics of agricultural production indicate a substantial increase in non-food grains output, while food grain production shows an opposite trend. The per annum increase in population in 1891 to 1947 was 0.67%, while total food grain production increased by only 0.11% in this period. The per acre production OT food grains decreased by 0.18% per annum. On the other hand, the increased demand in the market and the rising prices of highly commercialized non-food grain crops increased by 0.86% per annum and their total output by 1.31% per annum. The non-food grain crops were primarily cotton and jute but also included tobacco, sugarcane, oilseeds etc. 2.3.4 Impact of commercialization on rural society. Commercialization of agriculture paved the way for the generation of usury and merchant capital in rural society and widened the levels of differentiation among the peasantry. The common cultivator's dependence on the village baniya for advance of credit, for the marketing of his crop, for loans during lean seasons for subsistence, increased as commercialization progressed. In THC payment of land revenue also the money lender cum trader played an important role in supplying cash. Finally, the village baniya was also an agent for the penetration of the rural market by the imported industrial consumer goods, particularly Manchester cloth, while some of the poorer peasants were raising crops for the market virtually hypothecated in advance to the money lender. The better off section of the peasantry was relatively free. The latter could store their goods and wait for better prices than what prevailed during the glut in the market after harvest. Tajer could also cart their crops to markets in towns to obtain a better price than what the village baniya or itinerant dalala offered. Furthermore, they could make their own decision as to which crop to grow, while the poorest farmer was virtually forced to raise crops as demanded by the village baniya. In some regions, the rich peasants themselves became money lenders to poorer peasants and thus the process of differentiation was accentuated. In course of this differentiation process and the operation of money trading capital, an increasing number of peasants began losing their land and becoming the peasant landless laborers. It must, however, be noted that landless laborers had existed in the pre-colonial period too, particularly in the south of India in substantial numbers on account of servitude of some castes. It is the economic process of dapya santing and the significantly larger number of landless agriculturists which emerge as the characteristic features of the colonial period. According to estimates based on the 1931 census, we get the following picture of social strata in village India. At the bottom of the pyramid were the landless agricultural laborers, including bonded laborers, accounting for 37.8% of agriculturists. The stratum above them were the farmers with very small holdings of below 5 acres, 9%. And various types of tenants at will and sharecroppers, 24.3%. The layer above consisted of the better off section of farmers with land above 5 acres in size, about 25.3%. Finally, at the narrow top of the pyramid were members of the rent-receiving class, many of whom did not actually cultivate land themselves, 3.6%. The condition of the bonded laborers was the worst. They worked all their life, and sometimes for generations, for the master. Efforts to improve the condition of this class of people and the tenants will be discussed later. Unit 29, Block 15. 2.4 Modern Industry and Indian Capitalist Class. The pattern of industrial capitalist imperialism included an agenda of action by the colonial state for promoting the development of an economic infrastructure for the exploitation of the natural resources and raw materials of the colony. We shall turn to that aspect very soon. Suffice it to say that these infrastructural developments, particularly the railways and transport system, created conditions of development not only for foreign capital in some sectors, e.g. jute factories, coal mines, tea and coffee plantations, but also for indigenous capital. The latter extended industrial investment, first in cotton textiles, in the teeth of the opposition of Manchester interests and the inimical tariff policy of the British Indian government. From 1854, when the first Indian mill was set up in Bombay, till the World War I, the progress of Indian industrial capital was painfully slow and halting. It was the war and the interwar period which saw the rapid development and industrial diversification of Indian capital. This development was in part the story of struggle against foreign capitalist domination, most pronounced in eastern India. It also involved a struggle against British business interests which exercised powerful influence on policy making in England and also against the unsympathetic British Indian government. This would explain the emergence of alliance between the Indian capitalist class and the nationalist leadership who fully supported national capital. Within a colonial context, the growth of national capital was obvious, subject to severe Limitations. The potentials of colonial industrial development were exceedingly limited. From Shiva Subramanian's estimates of national income, it is clear how small was the extent of industrial growth even in the last 50 years of British rule. On the average, the ratio of industrial sector's share to the net domestic product was 12.7% in 1900 to 1904, 13.6% in 1915 to 19, and 16.7% in 1940 to 44. That India virtually remained where it was, predominantly agricultural, is clear from the ratio of income generated in the primary sector to the total NDP, 63.6% in 1900 to 04, 59.6% in 1915 to 19, 47, 6 feet y 0 in 1940 to 44. The tertiary sector alone showed a striking increase in its share, 23.7% in 1900 to 1904, compared to 35.7% in 1940 to 44. In common with many other colonial and industrially backward countries, India was characterized by stagnation in the level of national income. In the early years of British rule, we have no index of national income. In the 1860s, according to Dadabha Nauroji's calculation, the per capita income of India was 20 rupees per annum. We have already seen how Nauroji and others nationalists identified the drain of wealth from India as one of the causes of this poverty in India. About this time, 1870 to be exact, the per capita income in England, Mitchell and Dean's estimate, was 24.4 sterling pound. This was equivalent to 568 rupees. The more recent estimates of Shiva Subramanian suggest that in the last half-century of British rule, per capita income in India remained almost stagnant. In 1900 to 04 it was 52 rupees and 20 paise, in 1915 to 19 it was 57 rupees and 30 paise, and in 1940 to 44 it was 56 rupees and 60 paise, at constant price of 1938-39. This gives us an idea of the degree of underdevelopment and stagnation from which colonial India suffered. 2.5 The colonial state. The political impact of colonialism and resistance to colonialism in course of the freedom struggle is a subject to be dealt with later in this course, Block 2, 4 and 5. We are concerned here only with some of the political aspects of the colonial process. The colonial state was obviously not devised for fashioning the economy of India in the manner demanded by British imperial interests, but it was the most important instrument in serving that purpose. The professed political ideology of late 19th and early 20th century British rulers has been described as laissez-faire plus policemen. But departures from non-interventionism were frequent and fundamental. So far as a colony like India was concerned, the theory was that the country needed to be prepared through active intervention for making the civilizing mission of the West effective. Hence, for example, the heavy governmental support to British private capital in Indian Railways, in the form of guaranteed interest irrespective of profit and loss. This was evidently beneficial to British business interests. On the other hand, laissez-faire was insisted upon in the sphere of tariff policy, refusal to put any significant tax burden on imported Manchester cloth, for instance, was good for British interests and bad for all Indian mill owners. Again, laissez-faire was invoked to absolve the government from any intervention in trade in food grains, including export of grains, during the famines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The political structure in Britain ensured that important business interests could influence policy making in India through Parliament, the Secretary of State for India, who was a member of British Cabinet, the Governor-General, and the higher bureaucracy in India. Till World War I in particular, this influence was clearly visible. However, the necessity of making some compromise between home pressures and India's needs increasingly moderated the policies of the British Indian government in the later period. The viability of rule over India, financial stability of the government, need to strike compromises with Indian capitalists and other important interests, and nationalist pressures were some of the factors that modified British policies from the 1920s onwards. Subject to such qualifications, one can say that the colonial state was a serviceable instrument not so much for the modernization of Indian economy and society as for the colonialization of India from the middle of the 19th century to 1947. 2.6 Summary. The nature of colonial rule and its impact on the colony have been analyzed differently by different scholars. The Indian nationalist scholars like Dadabhai Nauroji, M.G. Ranade and R.C. Dutt spoke mainly about the Indian context and pointed out the impact of the British rule on the Indian economy. They emphasized the drain of wealth and their industrialization as the ill effects of the British rule. The European scholars, on the other hand, made a general survey of colonialism the world over and linked it up organically with the structure of capitalism. Scholars like Hobson, Hilferding, Rosa, Luxemburg and Lennon considerably enhanced our understanding of colonialism. Other aspects of colonialism in India were the commercialization of agriculture and a slow and uneven pace of industrialization. Indian economic advance was geared towards the requirements of colonialism, and the colonial state played an active role in shaping the Indian economy so as to serve the imperial interests. It was precisely because of the unfavorable British policies towards the Indian business interests that led to a confrontation between the colonial state and the Indian business groups, resulting in the latter joining the Indian national movement. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.